For me, I felt a lot of kind of tension when I came out, like, can I fully embrace my Palestinian identity and my queer identity at the same time? And it took me many years to realize that that attitude, that they were separate and I would have to glue them together, was something that I adopted from the world around me, and that they already were together inside of me, and it was the world that had to change and not me. Hi. My name is Sami Ortoleva. I use he, him pronouns, but any are also acceptable. And I'm a machine learning and data science researcher. So machine learning is the flip side to normal computer programming. In normal computer programming, you give computers very specific instructions, very precise instructions of exactly what you want them to do. This is not how people learn. People learn by you show them examples, and they kind of derive rules on their own of how to do the thing. And that's what machine learning is. We teach computers to do things by showing them examples and having them figure out the rules themselves. I'm a cisgender gay man, and I also identify as queer. I'm Palestinian. I was born and raised in the United States to a Palestinian mother. That side of my family, that identity, their resilience, the example they set for me is very important. My family is from a village called Al-Muzayriya. It's a small, or it was a small farming village, which was destroyed in the Nakba in 1948. I was born and raised in Bloomington, Indiana. It's a small college town around Indiana University. It's a very art and literature and music-centric community. It's very diverse. It has a large international student population, and it also has a large community of people who were international students and then decided to stay, like my mother. When I was growing up, my community was very family-centric. So my community was primarily my mother and my father and my brother and the members of the Arab and Muslim community around us in Bloomington. That was one part of my community, and the other part of my community was my very American, non-Palestinian, non-Muslim friends. So there was a lot of, there's some tension between those two parts of my community. I mean, my family, especially the Palestinian side of my family, they're scattered all over the world. Some are still in the West Bank, some are in Jordan, some are in the United Arab Emirates, some are in Europe, some are here in the United States. The resilience they've shown, their ability to adapt to whatever life throws at them. My grandfather, in particular, providing for my mother's family during and after the Nakba, really kind of set the tone, I feel like, for what the standard was for me. The only part of my immediate family that came to the United States was my mother.
Do you remember what your first access to queer spaces were as a young person, or at what point in your life kind of you started to have access to queer spaces, and what were those like?
I don't know if it's right to say that I didn't have access to queer spaces, or if it's that I didn't know that I needed to be accessing queer spaces. I didn't come out until I was 23. So I was already in graduate school. I had already moved to California. So I feel like I don't have a good sense of what the queer spaces were like in Bloomington, although Bloomington itself is a very queer welcoming community, which I only recognized after the fact. But yeah, I didn't actually start accessing queer spaces until I moved to San Diego, actually. There was a variety of queer venues throughout Hillcrest that I went to. And I met a lot of people in the broader LGBTQIA plus community. For me in particular, I found a lot of community in the bear community. I think it's pretty classic that I didn't recognize myself as queer or gay until I was 23, a little bit later than some folks. And then the second I realized, it was like going back through kind of like a slideshow of events in my life, and I was like, oh, this should have been so obvious, actually. Yeah, I've been gay the whole time, I just didn't recognize it. My interest in STEAM fields in general, and for me, I'm more on the technical side of STEAM fields. I'm more like science, engineering, and math. Was partially a result of straight up indoctrination by my parents. My father is also a physicist. My mother was a math teacher. So that was kind of the atmosphere in the house from a very young age. I have A distinct memory from when I was in college, I was taking a class on differential equations, and we were doing what's called boundary value problems in differential equations. And I just had this flashback to when I was in elementary school, and my father was telling me a bedtime story that I had no idea what he was talking about at the time. And I realized he was telling me a bedtime story about boundary value problems in differential equations, and I have been like indoctrinated from a young age. It was absurd. That was maybe like the seed of the interest, but where I ended up is very different from where I started in the technical side of STEAM fields. I started with just kind of a general interest in science and math. And then in high school, I was part of a solar bike and solar car racing team. So we would take bicycles and equip them with electric motors and solar panels and batteries. And we had a whole team of athletes who rode the bikes and engineers who constructed and designed the bikes. And I worked on the electrical side of that. And that was kind of my first taste with like hands-on work in a technical context. And I liked it a lot. It felt really good to be doing something hands-on that I could see the tangible results of. I ended up applying to study electrical engineering in college as a result of that, which took a little explaining to my mother because, one of those like small language barrier things, my mother being Palestinian, and her English was very good, but there's always just like little things that someone who learns a language as a second language speaker is not completely aware of. And she didn't know what the difference was between being an electrical engineer and being an electrician. So she had some feelings about that. So I studied electrical engineering in college and really just quickly took the tack of I want to study whatever I think is interesting at the time. And I'm not gonna like preordain for myself like what the end point is. So I was taking courses in electrical engineering, but I ended up doing research in a nuclear engineering department, working on material science for fusion reactors. And that was a lot of hands-on work in ultra-high vacuum chambers, doing ion bombardment of surfaces and characterization of those surfaces, a lot of late nights working on the equipment to try to make sure it would work in the morning for the next person who had to run the experiments. And a lot of that was very gratifying. I did work on a part of the experiment that went on NSTX, which is a fusion reactor in the United States. So I designed some of the electrical systems for the electron analyzer that was used for some characterization, for some surface characterization in that experiment. And then after many long nights of staying up and venting vacuum chambers and diagnosing and fixing problems, I realized I think I want to do theory instead of experiment. So I switched to theory and I applied to grad school. That's how I kind of ended up in theoretical physics. So I did my doctorate in theoretical physics, and then through that, I kind of evolved from starting in what's called condensed matter theory, which is the study of mostly quantum systems these days with many particles in them, to quantum information theory, and that is finally what led me to machine learning and data science.
And what was kind of the jump for you from kind of engineering into machine learning and AI? Like, could you maybe talk about that a little bit?
I think one of the kind of unifying points of interest in both the technical and the arts sides of STEAM fields is an interest in structure, kind of organization, repetitive patterns. When do those patterns break? Like, when is it interesting for those patterns to break? Machine learning is almost entirely about discovering and understanding and reproducing structure that appears naturally in data. So there's a very close tie between that in machine learning and that same idea in theoretical physics, where we're trying to understand what is the structure of some of the systems we're studying. So there was a natural connection. Some of the physics work that I did was more oriented towards here's specific systems made of like specific particles that you are supposed to be interested in studying. And in the course of doing some of that work, I just ended up becoming more interested in the mathematical techniques of understanding the structure than I did in the specific systems. So that's kind of what led me towards machine learning.
And moving kind of into AI and machine learning, like what other kinds of education and skills did you have to develop to get there?
So machine learning and data science involves a lot of computer programming, right? We're dealing with large data sets, and in principle, some of the mathematical techniques that we're doing, you could in principle do them by hand. In practice, you would never do so. So you need computers to be able to process the large amounts of data that make the techniques viable. Definitely, there was a lot of learning on the fly with coding. A lot of the mathematics itself directly transferred from physics. I think that there's a lot of cross-pollination in both the basic ideas and also the practical aspects of the mathematics from physics to machine learning. In my experience, in my personal experience at least, I didn't run into any overt discrimination as far as you are an LGBTQIA+ person, you are queer, you're a gay man, like we don't want you here. I didn't run into any of that. And that's a very like external notion, like someone else telling you, you don't belong here, there is not space for you here. I think there's also an internal notion where like we create barriers for ourselves. And those barriers can be imagined in a way and broken down internally. Like, oh, I just don't know anyone who's queer in this field, so maybe I don't belong. There's that aspect of it, but there's also a second aspect of the internal kind of barriers, which is more, I think, difficult to work past. And the second part is, given who I am as a person and given the values that I have, does this space reflect my values in a way that makes me want to be part of it? And I think that more in the technical side of STEAM fields, for me, this is the barrier that I run into more, and this is the part of the space that I find a little bit less welcoming. You know, there is a genocide happening right now in Gaza, in Palestine, and many of the companies and organizations that hire for the technical side of STEAM fields are either directly or indirectly involved. And regardless of whether they tell me they'd be happy to have me there as a queer person, do I actually feel welcome in that space? I think that the issue of being openly Palestinian in some of these spaces, given their ties to military industries, is much more difficult. Right? A lot of the research is directly funded by the military. There are many people who are professionally deeply involved in and tied to that funding from the military. That is the aspect that I have found difficult personally in these fields. There's a lot of pushes to like get funding when it's available because funding is scarce in academia. A lot of that funding comes with ethical questions that are sometimes difficult to answer and sometimes very easy to answer, and the answer is not what you want as a graduate student who desperately needs research funding.
I imagine that's particularly challenging in a city like San Diego. It's such a military city.
Yeah, there's a lot of very explicit military ties in the research in San Diego, but this is true across the country as well. Like one of the only ways that we as a society seem to be able to put money into basic research is by justifying it in terms of military applications. This is something that queer people and Palestinians have in common as well, is this kind of question of like, how is me being open with my identity going to affect my opportunities? How is that going to affect my professional life, my personal life, and also this idea that coming out is an event. It's a process. There's like the first time you come out, which is kind of an event in some contexts, but it's also a process and you have to continually make the choice to be out. Queer people and Palestinians both have to make that choice on a regular basis. I know people, like I have friends who have made active choices to not take positions in STEAM fields because of the ethical considerations of the position. I have made those choices myself. And so I think there's a big difference between a space being welcoming in the sense that, or this profession, like this field, the entirety of STEAM fields being welcoming in the sense that other people have created the space and you can come in if you want. That is one kind of acceptance, but I think it's a limited kind of acceptance. I think real acceptance is allowing us to shape the spaces ourselves so that we can help make them what they should be. I think especially in the technical side of STEAM, I can't speak so much to the art side from my own personal experience, but especially in the technical side of STEAM, that is much less present. I don't think anyone in a position of authority over hundreds of thousands, millions, tens of millions of research funding is really willing to listen to queer people, to Palestinians coming into a space and saying, maybe there's some ethical concerns with this funding. Yeah, I do think it's important to have LGBTQIA plus people in these spaces where technical decisions in my context are being made. So in my work in particular, a lot of the weaknesses in machine learning models are around really poor handling of what's called like outliers, edge cases, kinds of inputs that are not in the data set, are not represented in the data set that you train your models on. Whenever your systems interact with people, whether it's facial recognition or any other kinds of machine learning systems that directly interact with people, if you are not careful about how you acquire and curate your data set, there will just be massive gaps of like who is represented in your training set. And there are a lot of people who are doing this work to try to make sure that machine learning models are trained on more representative data sets. But if the people in the room making the decisions don't have any sort of connection to those communities, they might just not think it's important. And that is what has happened, and to a lesser extent now, I think, what is continuing to happen. But you need people representing their own communities in the room when these decisions are being made.
Are there any like workplace policies or practices that you would like to see more implemented in the field to support LGBTQ plus workers?
I think probably the most important thing that's maybe missing in a lot of these inclusivity efforts is actual representation in leadership, rather than policies mostly aimed at sort of PR, right? I think there's a lot of policies set up in workplaces, including academia. Academia is a workplace, it is labor, that are kind of aimed at making people feel good about stepping into the space when they're considering working there. And they're maybe not aimed at making sure the working environment long-term is actually healthy and positive for queer people. I think this is also true of Palestinians, incidentally, in workplaces, right? We are heavily policed in workplaces. Our conduct outside of the workplace is heavily policed, and there are many organizations that are more likely to simply let us go when they receive complaints about the fact that we exist in those spaces than to put anything on the line and back us up. I think organizations are primarily just risk averse, and this includes companies, this includes academia. They don't want to be perceived negatively, but if you want to be an ally to queer people or an ally to Palestinians, you have to accept a certain amount of risk. And if you're not willing to accept that risk, then you're not actually being an ally. I did some work in the later part of my PhD about improving a very old clustering algorithm. It's called spectral clustering. The details are not super relevant right now, but the basic idea was to take a large data set or a small data set and try to split it up into clusters that have like similarities. The data within each cluster has similarities to each other, but there's some large difference between the data in different clusters. This is the basic idea of data clustering. And spectral clustering does this in one particular way. And the work that I did to make improvements to spectral clustering relied on this idea of finding kind of the midway points, the data points that are kind of like data in one cluster, and they're also kind of like data in the other. They kind of straddle the divide. They have features from both. And I am Palestinian, and I am queer, and I was born and raised in America, and I feel personally very at many divides. I feel like I stand and kind of straddle a lot of different dividing lines. And there was some very nice sort of philosophical unity between the main idea of that project and some of the ways that I see my own life. So I enjoyed that work a lot. I think in terms of my career, the thing I'm most proud of is not so much like a specific project as my willingness to just do new things. I've felt very unconstrained in the sense that I'm perfectly happy to take up totally new fields that I didn't have any expertise in before and do new work. And that's terrifying because I'm doing things that I previously had no idea about. It's very empowering. It makes you feel like, oh, I can do basically whatever I want. And I can do a pretty good job of it. In my personal life, I think that I had a very formative time with my mother before she passed away, God bless her soul. And the time that we got to spend together before she passed away really affected me personally, and I'm glad that I set aside time during my doctoral program and took a leave of absence and got to go spend that last time with her. Those moments only come around rarely. You can't replace those moments before like a loved one passes away, and you should take those opportunities when you can. My future career goals, I'm in the middle of transitioning from academia to industry, so I'm really excited to kind of see what that new space is like for myself. I've been doing academic research for many years now, and yeah, I think kind of like a different flavor, certain ways that the environment is less constrained, certain ways that there are different focuses is going to be very invigorating, and I'm excited. On a rather trivial note, I I have been waiting to get a powerlifting coach for many years because it's not something that a graduate student salary is really like covering. So I'm very much looking forward to going into industry and being able to spend some time on my hobbies and feel empowered in that context from a monetary perspective, because that is the reality.
I'm also curious, like as you're kind of switching careers, if you want to say anything about this, like as you envision yourself kind of in this next stage, is there anything that would really excite you to be working on, or like some, I don't know, I guess like what would your dream job in this space entail? What kind of things would you be interested in working on?
I think that I'm very interested in working on like toolkits that are openly available that can be easily deployed for specific problems that people, small organizations, nonprofits have. I think that accessibility for machine learning is probably the biggest issue that the field has in terms of its potential benefits actually being realized. What advice would I give to my younger self? I would probably tell him that you're just gonna have to go through it. Like there's no way around it. There's no way to avoid it. But I think that I would also be very careful not to say too much, because all of the experiences that I had and all of the things that I went through, coming out with my mother passing away, with trying to find a way to kind of recognize the unity of my identities, like all of that was necessary to be who I am now. And I love who I am now. And I wouldn't want to change that by telling my past self something, or to changing something about my experiences.
What advice would you give to LGBTQ plus Palestinian youth who are, you can actually answer this either if you want to talk about what advice you would give them in general or specifically in entering into STEAM fields and navigating STEAM fields. So you can either pick one of those or do two-part.
I feel like anything I would say in this context would be more for broader society's perception of Palestinian queer people, and instead of Palestinian queer people ourselves, because we already know that we exist and we're valid. Maybe the advice that broader society needs about us is that we don't need external validation of our identity. We don't need other people to pontificate about what is best for us or decide what that is for us. There's a concerted effort to justify many of the terrible things that are done to Palestinians by kind of weaponizing queer rights and queer identity. But Palestinians ourselves, like many of us, are queer. The advice for everyone is that we need to be listened to. Like queer Palestinians need to be listened to.
My last question, if you feel comfortable giving an answer to this, I'm curious if you want to share any thoughts about why Palestinian liberation is an LGBTQ issue, like why the LGBTQ plus community should be, I mean, I feel like we are at the forefront of this in a lot of ways, but like, why is it important that the LGBTQ plus community is there and is involved in this? Can you talk about, if you want to share any of your thoughts on that?
I mean, I think that there's a lot of commonality between the struggles of Palestinians and the challenges and the struggles facing the LGBTQIA plus community. There's the issue of like how open we are about our identity in the context of like fearing backlash. And there's the issue of like access to healthcare. I have distinct memories of going with my mother to her doctor's appointments when she was dealing with cancer, and she would decide on a doctor-to-doctor basis who she told she was Palestinian and who she just said she's Mediterranean or she's Jordanian because she was fearful about the consequences of them understanding her identity in terms of her access to healthcare. There's this struggle for people to see us as fully human. There's also concerted efforts, sometimes in different and sometimes in overlapping sectors of the political landscape, to treat queer people as not people, particularly trans people as not people, and somehow monstrous and like a threat to civilization. And you hear the same rhetoric around Palestinians. There have been leaders, political leaders, who have talked about how the genocide happening in Gaza is about the struggle for Western civilization itself, which is rhetoric that sounds familiar to any queer person. You know, there's a lot of commonalities, and we're dealing with the same forces. So I think that it's important that we work together.